Well, thank you to Neil once again, and thanks to all of you for joining on this. As you see, it's the first slide is actually a book cover. I was just in Brazil giving presentations, and this is the Brazilian version of my book, The Elongated Skulls of Peru and Bolivia. And it's, of course, available on Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. But elongated skulls have been found in many different parts of the world, and they were always the elite members of a society. It was never the general public that looked like this, but only the nobility and the priesthood. So I dedicate this slideshow to my great mentor in Paracas, Senior Juan Navarro, who was very much an expert. He was an amateur archaeologist, but he knew more than many professional archaeologists because he had a deep love of the area and wanted to learn as much as possible. And this is a photograph of Senior Juan and a 20-month-old baby skull that is dated at 1930 years old from the Paracas culture. It was found in a cemetery called Chongos, which I will be showing Neil. And you see the size of it is much larger than normal. As well, you see the hair coloring is almost like a cinnamon color. And testing has been done of the hair of the ancient Paracas people, and the nobility had elongated skulls, and they also had reddish hair, or in some cases, blonde hair. So that indicates that their ancestry is not typically Native American, and the change in color is not the result of time or bleaching or anything else. It's genetically almost like a golden red, and no archaeologist wants to even look at that, which drives me nuts most of the time, but I've gotten used to the fact that academics are not interested in this subject whatsoever. So again, you have cranial deformation, which is taking a newborn baby of nobility and altering the shape of the skull, usually through some kind of boarding process. This was done in many parts of the world, most commonly on average about 2,000 years ago. But you will see as we go through the slides that the Paracas people are very distinctly different from any other people who had elongated heads. So in this slide or photograph, you see on the left-hand side is a Ucayali woman from the jungle of Peru, south of Iquitos, which is where Neil is going, I believe. And you can see the boarding that's been placed on this baby's head that she's holding. And then also the little child next to her, you see the bruising of the forehead. So it's deformation. It's changing the shape of the skull slightly, but not incredibly. And then the woman in the middle is, I believe, a Chinook woman from either Washington or Oregon from the 19th century. And you can see that her head as well has, the shape has been altered from being a newborn. And then on the right-hand side is another example of the process of altering the shape of a baby's head. In this case, the flathead people, again from the Oregon area of the United States. And then in Peru, we have this display, which is at the Coricancha Museum in Cusco, and they show different forms of head binding that were done to the Inca royalty. So most people don't know that the Inca had elongated heads. It's a practice which was banished by the Spanish in probably the 1540s. They were quite horrified, especially the priests, that anyone would do this kind of thing to a baby. But this is the conventional display of how head binding was done in the Cusco area of Peru up until the 1540s. And here again, you see another display in the same museum showing different techniques on the right of how deformation was done. What's curious is the one skull on the left is not from the Inca area. That's quite a famous Paracas elongated skull from the coast of Peru, about 3.5 hours drive south of Lima, which again is where I'll be meeting up with Neil and his wife. And I'll be able to show him the obvious differences between cranial deformation that was practiced in the area and those that we believe were born with elongated heads. Because the interesting thing is all around the world where there are still descendants of people who practice cranial deformation, the question is asked, why would you do this to your children? And the answer is, A, because we think it's very attractive. B, it's because we think they're it's a very beautiful aesthetic thing. And 3, this is what the ancestors looked like. And so the question, of course, comes to mind, who were these mysterious ancestors? And that is, of course, the process that we're working on right now on the coast of Peru. So again, many different parts of the world. You have cranial deformation. You have the northwest area of the United States going into the Pacific coast of Canada. You have the mound builders of the US. You have the Maya and possibly the Olmec of Mexico, and also the Andean people in different locations. That's going to be the focus of most of this talk. It's going to be Peru and Bolivia, because you find more cultures having practiced this than anywhere else in the world in terms of volume of people. And so my quest was to find out, in terms of timeline, what is the oldest culture in the Peru-Bolivia area that performed this, and is there some kind of timeline relationship between all of these cultures, and also geographically are there relationships? Then you also have the megalithic builders of Europe and the Hun, including Attila the Hun. Their invasion into Europe caused some of the nobility to perform cranial deformation. You also have some tribes in Africa and also Melanesia, as well as skulls have been found in Australia dating back 11,000 plus years that had clearly elongated heads and were not the Aboriginal people of Australia. So that makes Australia quite a fascinating place to research as well. So in the Peru area, this is a photograph I took illegally, so-called, at the Ica Museum, which is quite close to Paracas, and they have hundreds of elongated skulls of different shapes and sizes. You see the one that's in the background upper left, that's a very young individual with quite an altered head. And again, there are only about 5 of them on public display, but hundreds of them in the back room, not being studied by anyone. So the great creator god of the Peru and Bolivia area in general is the creator called Viracocha or Viracocha, and he is believed to have created the Andean world, possibly the entire world, but more specifically the Andean area of Cusco and Lake Titicaca. And he theoretically created the Inca culture by causing them to rise from the waters of Lake Titicaca, which simply means that much of the ancestry of the Inca comes from the Lake Titicaca area, and that's also backed up by archaeological research. But there's also this fascinating series of trails and roads in Peru. By the time the Inca were eclipsed by the Spanish, there were 25,000 miles of roads and trails in the Andean world. Not all of them made by the Inca. Many of them were much older, from much older cultures. But there's a specific path called the Path of Viracocha, which will be of interest in this discussion. Because this in this picture, you see this diagonal line going from the northwest to southeast. It's called the Kapaknyan, which means the royal road in the Inca language. And it's along this line that we find all of the megalithic structures in Peru and Bolivia. How this pertains to the present conversation is that at each one of these megalithic sites, we also find evidence that elongated skull people lived there. There has been no radiocarbon or DNA testing of any of these skulls, which is something I'm trying to alter or change. But it's interesting that at all of the megalithic sites, you find elongated skulls. And this is a more complicated pattern, but again, with this diagonal line going this way, you have all of the megalithic sites, and you also have elongated skulls. And then also this more shallow diagonal line going up this way. You see on the right-hand side, there's a place called Cochabamba, and then in the middle, Tiwanaku, and then in the slightly upper left, you have Paracas. And at all of these sites, again, you find elongated skulls. So this is a pattern that I'm trying to decode in order to find out why such a pattern is significant. So the oldest culture that we find in South America that had elongated skulls were called the Chinchorro. No one knows where they came from, what their origin was, but they were mummifying their dead 8,000 years ago, which is 3,000 years longer than the dynastic Egyptians. And there's a little museum in a town called Arica that I went to, and I saw evidence of some really quite fascinating specimens, such as this one. You can see that the textile is still quite intact on its head, and there is quite an elongated skull present in this individual. And then this is a different example in the same museum. You see that the skull is almost compressed vertically and extended towards the back with quite a fascinating hairdo design. And then this is one of the extreme examples. So you see how large this skull is in comparison to a normal skull. Is it the result of cranial deformation? Maybe, but the problem is that this example, of course, is behind glass, and there's been very little research done on this culture, and basically none done on why did they elongate their skulls. So then I decided to physically travel the path of Viracocha, starting in the southeast and traveling to the northwest. And all along this path again, we find different cultures that elongated their babies. This is a site on the path of Viracocha. It's called Mount Tunupa, and it's a volcano which is in the middle of the salt flats of Uyuni, which is located in Bolivia. It's actually the largest salt flat in the world. It takes 2 hours to drive from the little town to get to this mountain, traveling at 50 miles an hour. So you can see how large the salt flat is, and anywhere you look on the horizon, all you see is the flat surface of the salt. But inside one cave, there are some mummies that have elongated heads. They're not really huge, but you can see the distension that was clearly done to the nobility of these people in the distant past. The timeline is likely about 2,000 years ago for this culture. And then in a local museum, there are other examples. Again, you see slight deformation of the skull on the top and a flattening of the skull on the back. So this is clearly an example of cranial deformation. Again, the age of this individual probably lived between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. Next along the line, we come to Cerro de Potosi, or Mount Potosi, which is one of the largest silver mines in the world that was exploited by the Inca, but even more so by the Spanish. Once the Spanish conquered the Inca, etc., this mountain is where most of the silver of South America that fed Spain and Europe in general came from. There was one seam of pure silver that was 10 feet thick. And here, in another local museum, you see extremely distended, elongated skulls. Now, these could be beyond the capability, or at least the one on the left, a very young individual, could very well be beyond the capacity of doing cranial deformation, because such a change in shape of that skull over a short period of time, such as 2 years, would likely have killed the child. So the candidate on the left is one of our candidates for the possibility of someone who was born with an elongated head. And then another culture called the Huancarani, again located along the path of Viracocha. You see the extreme deformation of this skull. The volume is maybe 10% larger than a normal human being, but this is one of the extreme examples of probable cranial deformation. And these people lived about 3,000 years ago, south of the Lake Titicaca area on the path of Viracocha. Then we reach the very famous Tiwanaku, again located right on the path of Viracocha. And this is the famous Sun Gate. Most archaeologists believe that this work was done by the Tiwanaku culture, but it's more likely that the Tiwanaku people 2,000 years ago found a destroyed complex of temples slash buildings that had been created thousands of years before with lost ancient forms of high technology. And this is an example. You see the beautiful straight lines, not 90-degree angles, which is curious, that you find at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. And engineers that I've taken to this location to this very day can't understand how we in the 21st century could create some of these shapes. We don't see any tool marks whatsoever. We don't see any mistakes. So whoever created these interesting flat shapes had forms of lost ancient high technology. And in this area, there are numerous elongated skulls. This one is actually one that was found on private property. There was a man digging the foundation for a small building, and he stumbled across part of the Royal Pumapunku Cemetery. This skull, you can see, is swept back, almost looking like Akhenaten and his daughters of Egypt. The important point to make about Akhenaten and his daughters is we only find the portraiture and the sculptures that show that they may have had elongated skulls. Neither Akhenaten nor Nefertiti nor the 6 daughters, their bodies have never been found. And so we don't have physical evidence in terms of skeletons that they had elongated heads. However, it's obvious that Akhenaten was trying to tell something through the portraiture and through the sculptures of the heads, that he knew sacred knowledge of some kind. And I think what he was trying to tell people was not that he had an elongated skull, but that his family ancestors way back in time could very possibly have not been Homo sapiens sapiens. They could have been some kind of hybrid, but that would be many thousand years before the time of Akhenaten. He was very much adept at the mystery schools, and compared to other pharaohs, and that's what caused him to be the great so-called heretic, is he wanted his people, all of the Egyptian people under his power, to know about who he was and where he came from, whereas the other Egyptian pharaohs tended to like sculptures of themselves that made them look really strong and powerful and manly, whereas he simply told his sculptors, portray me as I am. And that's why he looks kind of like a hermaphrodite of some kind, very much with some female features and male features. He's my favorite pharaoh. So at the Lake Titicaca Museum at Tiwanaku, they have facial reconstructions of actual skulls. There are skulls underneath this, this clay or putty of some kind, and you can see that the facial features are quite curious. No DNA testing has been done thus far of these individuals, probably because the Bolivian government honestly doesn't want to know about the idea that the ancestry and history of the Lake Titicaca area may not be the conventional story of them being 100% Native Americans, the Tiwanaku culture. They could have been a very complex bloodline from different parts of South America, or in fact, different parts of the world. And that, in fact, could be what the Inca were as well. The Inca may not have been 100% Native Americans, and it's the Paracas culture that will be giving us the clues to this as we go along in the presentation. So next along the path of Viracocha is the Island of the Sun, where we find some megalithic remains. They've been taken apart and then reconstructed in later times. So it's a beautiful island to visit, not that impressive in terms of archaeology, but kind of intriguing. And some elongated skulls have been found in this area. And then other ones in the Lake Titicaca area. This is from a tiny museum at a little village called Watahata. And this is maybe a 1-year-old baby. And you see how the shape of the head is quite vertical. So this again, and you see the eye sockets are quite huge. So this again could be a candidate for DNA testing. And we're hoping to be able to do that. Since it's in a private collection, we don't have to go through the governmental authorities. And so that will make the possibility of doing DNA testing much more rapid a process, because getting involved with the governments of Peru or Bolivia is incredibly complicated in terms of bureaucracy. The DNA testing that we're presently doing on the Paracas skulls, the paperwork started 2.5 years ago, and that's why it's been quite frustrating, but we are moving forward with the procedure. So another site, again along the path of Viracocha, is called Silustani, and here we find large megalithic towers, which were used by the local cultures as funeral towers, but they were not created by the local cultures in the timeline that archaeologists believe, because whoever did this work had to have had some form of lost ancient high technology, because these towers are wider at the top than the bottom, and there is no clay or mortar. These stones fit together perfectly, and to create a rounded shape like that would be very complex. Also, the stone is basalt, which is very hard and would require at least hardened steel tools, which were not present in this part of the world until the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. So it's all part of, again, of decoding history. You read the standard archaeological accounts and you start to take them apart. This is also some of the work that we're doing in Egypt, proving that such structures as the Great Pyramid were not made by the dynastic Egyptians, but are likely at least 12,000 years old. And that's a completely different topic. That's what my book Aftershock is based on, the idea that many of the great megalithic structures on the planet were created prior to the end of the last ice age, and the last ice age ended very abruptly 12,000 years ago. So again, here at this location, a little museum with some examples of cranial deformation of skulls. You see the volume is basically the same as a normal person, so this is a skull whose shape has been altered. And next we go to Arequipa, and there are skulls on display in remote locations at tombs. that are somewhat elongated, such as the individual on the left. And even to this day, people come and bring offerings to these ancient ancestors. You see the flowers, someone's put a flute there. So it's interesting that in a very Catholic country, you still have ancient belief systems that are reasonably strong. Then, 1 hour's drive south of Cusco, we come to the Andahuaylias Museum. And this is where we find the very fascinating little skeleton called Waikiki. I've taken numerous medical professionals, mainly from Europe and the United States, who have been, and Canada, who have been on tour with us, and we've taken them to show Waikiki to them, and none of them have any idea what they're looking at. They're all completely astonished because, of course, a medical professional is someone who has studied the anatomy of Homo sapiens sapiens, and all of them have said that this is not an example of any disease they can think of. You see the size of the eye sockets, you see the size of the skull compared to the torso. The skull is in fact the size of the torso. So this is clearly a great candidate for DNA testing, and there are samples of Waikiki at 2 labs, one in the United States, one in Canada. There are only 10 laboratories on the planet that could study ancient DNA of this age. Waikiki died about 850 years ago, and so we're hoping to get those results very soon. Again, it's in a private museum. The curator allowed us to take samples, and he bears all responsibility should there be any problems with government officials or meddling. So here you see the side of Waikiki, and again, the size of the skull compared to the torso. You see the back looks like it may have been flattened, but the forehead area is pretty complicated, and Waikiki also has 2 less sets of ribs than normal, and also the rib cage appears to be upside down. So one anatomy expert that looked at that said that there's no way that this is Homo sapiens sapiens whatsoever. This has to be, if nothing less, it has to be a subrace of humanity, or possibly something even more complicated and, shall we say, interesting. Now, we see the fontanelle on top of the head has not closed, so that would mean that Waikiki died at approximately 20 months of age, and evidence that was done by 6 different doctors in Cusco. Waikiki was taken to a major clinic and was CAT scanned and MRI'd and X-rayed, and all of the doctors who examined Waikiki said, I have no idea what it is I'm looking at. There are no diseases that can explain what this is. This is the only specimen of this kind that any of them had ever seen. So, unfortunately, only one example like Waikiki has been found so far, but it is quite possible that in the Central Museum in Lima, the capital of Peru, at the Archaeology and Anthropology Museum, they have a warehouse that contains the remains of 10,000 ancient Peruvians, and it's quite likely that they are housing many bizarre-looking examples of humanoids or humans, but they are not on display, and I have not been given access to take photographs or video because I don't have the right archaeological credentials. However, we are in contact and working with the director, hoping to convince her to allow us to be able to photograph and film some of the interesting specimens that they have in this warehouse. If you notice the teeth, the 3 teeth you see are molars, and they have roots. And that is not something which you're supposed to find in a 2-year-old baby. So that, again, is another anomaly about Waikiki. And so the work continues. In the same cemetery, which was a royal cemetery where Waikiki was found, the remains of a 16-year-old princess was also found, and her skull is underneath this coating. Again, this is an example of cranial facial reconstruction. And so you see that her head is quite a bit larger than normal. So it is quite possible that she, like Waiki, is an example not of cranial deformation, but of someone who could have been born with an elongated head. Unfortunately, she has not been DNA tested or also radiocarbon tested, so we don't know when she died, but likely somewhere around 1,000 years ago. So as we are entering into the city of Cusco, we pass by numerous megalithic structures, including this gate called the Sun Gate, which is on the path of Viracocha. And you see the very large stones on the bottom and the smaller stones on top. This is one of many examples of reconstruction by the Inca. The small stone work is the work of the Inca built on top of a megalithic structure that they found about 1,000 years ago when they first entered the city of Cusco. And rather than being, or rather than the story that standard academics tell us that there was nothing in Cusco before the Inca arrived except maybe some very roughly built cottages or buildings, the Inca discovered and abandoned and destroyed megalithic city. And the reason why they built Cusco is because it was the city of the gods. They saw the profound stonework and they said, this site has to be super important, so we will build our center here rather than in the Sacred Valley, which would have made more sense nearby, because the Sacred Valley is where all the food is produced. Not too much food is produced in Cusco, and it's illogical to build a city far away from your food source. So, the Inca culture. This is a portrayal of a Inca noble person. You see that the headwear that this person is wearing is slightly elongated, but what is more curious is the representation of the hair, because you see it's red colored. And some people might think that it's just a coincidence. However, when the conquistadors entered Cusco for the first time, one of Pizarro's brothers noticed that there were some light-skinned people who were very tall and had reddish or blonde hair living in Cusco. And the Spanish conquistadors were supposed to be the first of the European or foreign people to ever enter Cusco. So he asked the local people, who are these light-skinned people I see who have skin lighter than mine? And he was told, these are the last of the Viracochans, the children of Viracocha that came from a foreign land to teach us and other people science and advanced agriculture and the arts. So in the Coricancha Museum, which is in the basement of the Coricancha, are 4 skulls on display. They're listed as being Inca, but they've never been carbon-14 tested. So we don't know whether they were Inca or possibly even older. What's most intriguing is the second to the right skull does not have the standard suture lines of a normal human being, which we'll get into a little bit later. And this is again, this is a baby that is found in the Inca Museum in Cusco, said to be of the Inca culture, but has never been DNA or radiocarbon tested. So we don't know what culture it's from. It could be Inca, but this baby died between 1 and 1.5 years of age. And you see the extraordinary elongation of the skull. So again, any medical professional that's looked at this skull has stated that it's very unlikely that it's cranial deformation, because trying to alter the shape of the skull that much would kill the child. And also the volume of this baby is at least 50% larger than a normal human being. Then we have another amazing site at the northern end of the Sacred Valley called Ollantaytambo. And this is a combination of Inca construction as well as megalithic. If you see or look at the middle of the picture, up on top of the hill, you see those trapezoidal shapes and then some large blocks. That is what remains of the megalithic aspect of Ollantaytambo that was discovered by the Inca, and they built a major center in the area. So there's also this amazing sculpture, which I think is actually a carved profile of a human face or humanoid face across the valley from Ollantaytambo. The head is 500 feet tall, and you can see there's an eyeball with a slit in it, and there's also a mouth with one fang and a beard. So for hundreds, if not thousands of years, people have believed that this is the profile or the face of the great teacher called Viracocha, who was sent by the creator god Huitzilopochtli to educate the people in fine arts and sciences. And in a nearby cave on the other side of the valley, you can see on the left there are normal shaped skulls, but then there's a very large one. You compare that one in terms of shape and volume with the others, and you see it's very big. And then the full skeleton on the right, you see that is a very large skull with a protrusion here on the forehead, and that's a factor that we'll look into as well when we start to look at the Paracas culture, because that's an attribute that I believe is part of those that were born with elongated heads and later were mimicked by other cultures through cranial deformation. So another little museum that has some interesting looking skulls. Here again, we have a baby that was maybe 1 year old, and you see the major distension of the skull. This could be an example of cranial deformation, but perhaps not. And then at another location, which is a combination of megalithic, lost ancient high technology, and much cruder work. You see the wall behind me is much cruder than these massive basalt slabs that were recycled by what is called the Wari culture that existed in the highlands of Peru between 600 and 1000 AD. Again, at many of these ancient sites, we see megalithic aspects that were recycled by a later culture. And in that museum, you see the skull in the center with a lot of holes drilled. We see very much a relationship between elongated heads and cranial trepanation. It's quite possible that when the cultures began to do cranial deformation as the result of the die-off or the breeding of the elongated skull natural people with normal people, that complications arose, because the original population of those with elongated heads most likely was quite small, and they couldn't keep breeding with each other because that would create all sorts of genetic problems. So they were basically forced to, or possibly willingly, interbred with normal looking people of the area. But as the course of time went on, the shape of the skull would begin to shrink, and that would mean that the nobility over time would no longer look different from the local population. And so that is probably why the cranial deformation processes began, but with applying too much pressure onto the skull of the little child, it could have caused the buildup of pressure and fluid inside of the skull, and thus holes had to be drilled in order to release the liquid and the pressure. So yet another museum nearby. You can see that I'm pointing to quite an elongated skull. Again, no radiocarbon testing, no DNA testing. I and those I'm working with are the first people ever to conduct DNA testing on the elongated skulls of Peru. And that's why it will be very groundbreaking once we actually get the results back. And we're taking our time with it because it's a very complicated, very expensive process. Again, only 10 laboratories in the world can do this kind of work because You, of course, can have your blood sampled and you can find out your exact genetic heritage, because that DNA is taken from a living being. But as soon as you die, the DNA begins to break down. And after 2,000 years, or even 1,000 years, the DNA has broken down, it's been corrupted by bacteria, etc. And my analogy to this is your DNA is like a perfect strand or cord, and so it's intact and perfect. But ancient DNA is like taking that beautiful strand and putting it into a blender for 5 minutes. So it takes it takes the most sophisticated computers in the world to be able to decode the haplogroups, which is the genetic ancestry of these people. And that's why we're taking our time making sure that the process is done as perfectly as we possibly can. This is just another, again, megalithic site in the area. Now we're starting to travel west towards the Pacific Ocean. And again, you see the perfect blocks on the right-hand side, and then the cruder work that was done later. And lo and behold, an elongated skull is in one of the niches at this location. And you can see that to this very day, there are some people who are venerating them by offering water, and there's an orange, and somebody left a cigarette there, as in a tobacco offering. So it's interesting that these ancient belief systems are still being practiced, which is great, I think. And in another little museum very close to the location in the previous slide, we have some truly astonishing examples of not cranial deformation. So this completely blew my mind when I first saw it. You see, it's a perfectly preserved mummy. The head is the size of the torso, more or less, and the complexity of the shape of the head indicates that it is not the result of cranial deformation, because we don't see the flattening of the surfaces. It's a very compound and complex shape. This individual died likely at about 4 years of age. And I believe that this is an example of the original Paracas people. Unfortunately, the curator of the museum knows very little about this specimen. He said it was found locally, but he doesn't know exactly where. He doesn't know what culture it comes from. He doesn't know how old it is. So we've asked to have DNA samples taken, but he said no, because this museum is part of the Ministry of Culture of Peru. You will have to go through the diplomatic and bureaucratic channels, but we are planning on attempting to do that, if possible. So again, this just emphasizes the size of this head. It's truly astonishing. The eye sockets are not extremely huge, but you see the process, the fingers are bound together. So this person was clearly venerated and was likely a member of the nobility of the higher classes of whatever culture this was, maybe the Paracas. We don't know what he or she died of, but it's just one of those things. You drive into a small village somewhere in the area and astonishing things are presented to you. We asked if there are more at this location, and he said, yes, we have more specimens, but they are in sealed boxes and they can only be opened up through approval of the Ministry of Culture of Peru, which is a long process. The iconic elongated skulls. The one on the left has been photographed and has been on the internet for a long time. It's been described as being anything or everything from a Nephilim to a hybrid to an Anunnaki to an alien to whatever. But what we know is it's located in the Ica Museum, which is an hour's drive south of Paracas, Peru, and it comes from a very specific cemetery called Chongos. You can see there it's written on its skull. So that's a Peruvian elongated skull. It's not from the Middle East. It's unlikely to be Anunnaki. It's unlikely to be Nephilim, because those are Middle Eastern phenomena. But the amazing thing is that the largest elongated skulls in the world are found in an area of less than 10 acres. No other skulls that I've ever seen photographs of or in person can match the elongated skulls that come from Chongos, which is a location we're going to be taking Neil and his wife to so that he can document it for himself. And it is possible because there's still a lot of active tomb robbing going on in the area. It's a location that's quite remote, so it can't be patrolled by the police or government officials. And so occasionally we will find an elongated skull on the surface because tomb robbers have gone there to rob the mummy of any valuable, such as possible gold or silver ornaments or pottery or textiles. The Paracas textiles are among the most valuable of any textiles in Peru, or actually the world at this point. And a full mantle, which is a cloak worn by a royal Paracas, can fetch as much as $1 to $2 million on the black market. So Julio Citeo is the great champion archaeologist of Peru, of the ancient cultures of Peru. And almost all of the knowledge about the Paracas are based on his work. But his work ended in the 1940s, and so he was never able to use such technologies as radiocarbon testing or X-rays or MRIs or DNA testing, etc. And unfortunately, most present-day archaeologists base all of their work on the work of Julio Citeo, whose work ended 70 plus years ago. And that's why I'm more or less on my own in terms of studying the Paracas, because I'm not getting any serious attention from archaeologists. They think I'm just some foreigner who's on some level meddling in their work, but at least I'm applying actual science to the study of these ancient people, along with many experts of different disciplines from different countries in North America and Europe. So he believed, based upon pottery, that the Paracas came from the Central Highlands of Peru. So this is a culture from the Central Highlands, and then he compared this with the pottery of the Paracas. And obviously he was not an art expert, because there is no similarity between this, which is from the Chavin culture, and this, which is the Paracas culture. But most archaeologists to this day still believe that the Paracas came from the Central Highlands, but where they came from before that, they don't know. And if you ask them, did the Chavin people perform cranial deformation, they would say no. So then you ask, well, did the Paracas simply spontaneously decide to deform their children's skulls? And so you can see where this is going. They don't have any answers that make any logical sense, so they simply come up with something to try to shut people up and get them to leave. So the small museum in Paracas, which was run by Senior Juan Navarro, who unfortunately died a year and a half ago, is a collection of 45 different elongated skulls. This is a location where, of course, we will take Neil and his wife. And there are many different shapes and sizes of the Paracas here, different ages, different cemeteries, and the shapes of the skulls seem to be specific to the cemetery. Most of the examples of cranial deformation, but again, it's the ones from the Chongo Cemetery that are the most interesting and are the candidates for those that I believe could very well have been born with natural elongated skulls and did not originate in South America. So this shows you a map of Paracas. You see the bay, or you see where it says Pisco on the top of the picture. And Paracas is one of the largest natural bays on the coast of Peru. So let's say you were a navigator traveling from a different part of the world. The one thing you would want would be a safe harbor. And since the wind blows from the south 80 to 90% of the time, the Paracas Bay would be a perfect place for a long distance traveler or navigator to find shelter, and eventually settle and set up a civilization. So this is located at Lake Titicaca, but you see these boats are made out of what is called totora reed, which has been growing in that area for thousands, if not millions of years. And also totora is found on the coast of Peru. So it's very likely that the Paracas people created boats out of totora reed. Also, cotton grows naturally on the coast of Peru, so you could make a sail out of cotton, and you could build a very seaworthy craft that could go reasonable or maybe very great distances, because in the archaeological record, we find that the Paracas were hunters of sea lions. Sea lions are very fast, so you'd have to be a very expert sailor to be able to chase them. And we also have evidence that the Paracas were whale hunters, and the whales that travel along the coast of Peru are found several miles out to sea. So that would take great sailing capability. And maybe that's a capability that they inherited from their ancestors who came from a different part of the world. Also in the archaeological record, we find spondula shell. This was used by the nobility to make jewelry and other adornments, and it is only found on the coast of Ecuador. So it's very unlikely that traders were walking down the coast of Ecuador and then Peru in order to get to Paracas in order to trade. It's much more likely that the Paracas sailed northward to Ecuador, traded different things from the Paracas area for the spondula shell, and then they would wait for the seas or the winds to change and then sail back home. This is one of the largest of the so-called Nazca system of geoglyphs and lines. Most people are acquainted with the Nazca lines and geoglyphs, which of course are located in Nazca, which is southeast of Paracas. But what they don't know is that the whole system begins at Paracas. This is called the Candelabro, and it's 500 feet tall, and it actually points to Antarctica, which is interesting. But these geoglyphs go all the way from Paracas down through the Nazca area, which is a distance of more than 250 kilometers. The majority of the lines and geoglyphs were created by the Paracas culture that existed before the Nazca culture ever arrived. So that's something most people don't know, but it's an important historical point. Here is an example of a mummified Paracas person, and the photograph is not that great. However, once Neil sees this in person, he will see that it's a very natural looking shape. Also, where the spinal cord enters the skull at the bottom is quite far back, which is quite intriguing and something we'll get into a little bit later. And this person had short, wavy, thin, red hair. This is another elongated skull, but it's from a different cemetery. This one is from the Chongo Cemetery, where the largest ones are found. And this one is found at another ancient Peruvian cemetery called Cerro Colorado. You see, the shape is quite different from this one. So again, the shapes seem to be specific to the cemetery, which means specific to the different Paracas centers. I don't know why that is, but that's why I'm only partway through my study. And then here again is another ancient cemetery. This is called Camacho, located a little bit north of Paracas. And this is an example of cranial deformation. You see the flattening of the forehead and a bit of flattening in the back. So the volume is the same as a normal person. The shape is a little bit different. And this is probably the last phase of the Paracas people before they were invaded by the Nazca. Most conventional archaeologists believe that the Nazca moved in due to drought conditions in the north and simply amalgamated with the Paracas. But it's my contention that the Nazca entered the area and basically tried to wipe out the royal red-headed Paracas people, and then took over their lands and expanded and moved into the Nazca area, and over the course of time created their figures, about 25 of them, of the geoglyphs, including the famous ones such as the hummingbird and the spider and the monkey. But they were their own undoing, because they basically found an area that was savanna-like, like in Africa, and they systematically defoliated the area in order to plant crops and also to create millions of ceramic pieces. And so they destabilized and destroyed their environment. And so there's no great mystery as to what happened to the Nazca. They had to abandon the area and likely went east into the highlands of Peru, into areas that still had decent rainfall, etc. But they disbanded themselves and simply were absorbed into the cultures of the highlands of Peru.